Thanks very much. We've been gathering some questions, and we'll be gathering more, so please don't hesitate to write them down and pass them to the ushers. Here's a question about the evolution of your thinking about government and foreign aid. Has your view of development and the role of foreign aid in the areas you help changed over the years?
Well, foreign aid is another topic that was very obscure to me before I got into the foundation. If you survey the US public, they think that a substantial part of the US government's budget goes to foreign aid. In fact, it's less than 1/2 of 1% is going to foreign aid. And even within that, there's a huge piece of it that's more sort of Cold War funding, where it actually goes to people who you may not like them, but at least they're on your side. Some of it goes to fund acute things like famine, where you're not really saying things will be better afterwards, but at least you save lives, you get people through. Then there's the money, about half of all of it, that actually goes to funding vaccines, funding better agricultural practices. And it's actually, the US, compared to other countries, of all the rich countries, except for very few, is the least generous. That is, compared to the Europeans, we're about a fifth if you take a percentage of GDP. That's probably the right metric. There's the really great countries that are at 0.8%, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands. And then there's people like us that are below 0.2% of GDP. And people like to talk about one part of that foreign aid that didn't go well, or was misspent. But in fact, most of it is spent extremely well. You take the whole thing about getting AIDS drugs out in the world. If it wasn't for the US, there would be 4 million people who wouldn't be alive. And so that's one where the US actually was at the forefront and is substantially the largest funder. So yes, I'm a big believer in foreign aid generosity. In the next few years, these government budgets, the US and others, are so in deficit that the chance that these things are what's going to get cut, even though they're a tiny part of a big number, they may get reduced instead of growing like they have been. They've been growing. The low point, this is a strange fact, the low point in US generosity was 2000. That is, at the end of the Clinton administration, was the least generous the US has ever been. Then it grew quite substantially by over a factor of 2 up till now. But and there was a commitment, a campaign commitment made to double it again. And so we hope that can be fulfilled. But there's a good chance, you look at all the demands and what's gone on, there's a good chance that even maintaining for the next couple of years won't be easy.
As a graduating senior with no job and ever-mounting financial concerns, how can I still make a difference in the topics you spoke of today?
Well, you're probably not going to be too picky about the gigantic salary, so that's good. It means that many of these areas that aren't as remunerative, you can get not as much financially, but the psychic reward. Certainly, I don't minimize in any way the tough challenge people have. It's a tough time to graduate, and I'm sure that creates a lot of turmoil. I do hope that some opportunities open up in these areas. Certainly, if the foreign aid stays high, there's lots of opportunities there. The US, USAID, just to take one agency, has such a need for expertise. I mean, they have tons of open positions. Now, whether that's a fit for what people want to do in their background, I don't know, but it's certainly a great example. Is it a time in your life where you could go off and go to one of these developing countries and spend a year or two and do some work and get immersed? How would you make that budget work? That's tricky, but there are opportunities like that. So maybe that you can turn that into a positive thing.
You mentioned Teach for America in your talk.
That's right, and what's amazing is, Berkeley was one of the schools with the most applicants. Even there, their capacity to accept people, so Berkeley actually had a fairly high percentage, about 15% of those who applied got in, but it was only 15%. And so we're trying to get the capacity of that program up. I think 69 were accepted, which is phenomenal. And it's been a very catalytic program because it's getting these school districts to think differently because they have talented, committed personnel.
Could you give us an example of how you ensure sustainability in the projects you start up overseas?
Yeah, you've got to have interventions that are very inexpensive and very practical to deliver. And vaccines are pretty magical. They're not the only thing we do. We do clean water, we do sanitation, savings. But vaccines are a great paradigm because you put in, kind of like software, a lot of money up front to invent it. And then the marginal cost of making it can usually be brought down to be at most a few dollars. You have to work on that piece. And then you piggyback the delivery system that's delivering the other vaccines. And you don't need any doctors. We still have this cold chain thing, but we think we can use super thermoses that are cheap to even avoid that over time. So it's very inexpensive. When you look at healthcare, there's a few things that deliver overwhelming the benefits. Even in this country today, vaccination, it does more than most everything else put together in terms of lengthening life. And yet it's a few percent of the money that gets spent. So it's very high return. Likewise, a new seed is a pretty spectacular thing, whether you need hybrids or not. Once you get that into a community, then the farmers are using it, and it just keeps on being available. So it's that type of thing that's catalytic, and the marginal costs are very small. If somebody says, well, why don't you start orphanages throughout Africa? That's a great thing, and I hope many people are funding that type of thing. But that's a delivery initiative. Much more for me, I'd say, okay, let's get an AIDS vaccine so you have less orphans. Well, it depends on where you think your relative expertise is. Is it picking scientific groups to do that and getting the trials to be quick and all that, or is it in those end delivery things? So we're pretty picky about the things that have built-in sustainability if they work. That means we take some high-risk things.
The Gates Foundation has been a catalyst that has brought new capital, energy, and attention to global health. What skills and experience do you feel are most important for current students to acquire to become leaders in the future of global health and best make use of the resources and enthusiasm in this area?
Well, to be good in global health, you really do have to be pretty multidisciplinary. I mean, yes, there are some scientists who learn immunology and help invent the vaccines and the adjuvants where they're very focused on that. And that's fantastic. We'll make sure there's more funding for people who do that. That is great work. But once you move away from that to where you start to think about the delivery issues or the getting more people drawn into this, you've got to start to understand the economics of delivery, the social resistance that you get about vaccines, creating demand from the mothers that they really insist that it come in. And understanding government aid issues. How do you convince various governments to do more? How do you convince India to get serious about where their vaccine coverage is terrible? They are the worst in the world, and it counts because over 20% of the birth cohort comes from that one country, primarily up in the north. Then you're going to have to be multidisciplinary. You're going to want to learn the science and know, what vaccines are, what the history of those are. You're going to have to learn some public health stuff. You're going to have to learn a little bit of government and politics and communication skills. So, the foundation is looking for hardcore specialists who understand things, but a lot we're looking for generalists. And the field, I'd say honestly, if you compare in the field of software and you say, hey, let's do a press conference and make some goofy new game seem cool, the number of great marketing people you have is just huge, and everybody knows how to do it. When you take something that should be only about 1 million times easier and say, hey, let's have a press conference about saving children's lives and see if we can get somebody to come, the amount of talent you have to draw on is just far less. And yet, the cause should naturally be more interesting. The amount of creativity that has to be brought to this stuff, so it's not just, oh, hey, we're here to remind you that things are tough in poor countries and you're not doing enough, which kind of pushes people off. There's a lot of these multidisciplinary people who are very, very effective. And so, you either have to decide, I want to be one of those specialists, which is great, or one of those more generalists. And if you're a generalist, you're not going to be able to take all the courses you need to know. You're just going to have to read a lot of it or have friends who know it or be good at working with people who have those skills.
What are your thoughts about microfinance?
Well, microfinance is an important element in letting poor people improve their condition. Like any single thing, it's easy to go too far and saying, wow, this is it alone. Because after all, the interest rates involved are quite high because the transaction costs are quite high. And that's why we've got to get digital money, cell phones in, so that you can get these interest rates. The interest rates are often above 20% a year. And in these poor countries, there aren't that many activities that can pay back at that rate. There are some, and it's a very good thing. But that alone, if you don't do savings, if you don't get the health issues right, if you don't get female literacy right, just doing the microfinance alone has a fairly modest effect. So it's a wonderful thing. And Eunice does good work. Abed, who did Barack, does incredible work. And we funded a lot of that. We are doing more funding of savings right now because that has been very underfunded in the field. We're doing a lot of funding of sanitation. That tends not to get funded. So microfinance is great. Bangladesh has super high penetration of microfinance. And so if you want to say to yourself, okay, here's Bangladesh here, and over here next to it you've got West Bengal, a state of India, and you say, okay, is Bangladesh substantially better off, and try and adjust for the different factors? And the answer is somewhat. The effect of the women's microfinance groups has actually been more provable on behavioral issues like getting birth control when they want it, taking care of their children, than it has been on any economic related figure. So you could justify all that work just by getting women together to talk about issues and to be politically active, that when things aren't delivered, they as a group can act. That's a more provable outcome. You compare Pakistan to Bangladesh, same sort of GDP level. The birth rates, the child health practices are dramatically better. And Grameen, BRAC, who are the big microfinance groups, they deserve a substantial part of the credit for that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Looks good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. You're no longer a crimson, but a blue and gold. And you know what? In return, we'll get you 1 million Facebook messages. So thank you very much for coming out today and for continuing to give back in every aspect of your lives. And go Bears.
The young man who just spoke was a boat person refugee from Vietnam.
Oh, really? Wow.